We'll hit on that in a minute. Next up, probably going to go to crankbaits or spinning rod applications. That's the dog playing with her bone in the floor is what that is. You can see I've got several rods laid out here, and I want to try to be as specific but not make this video like a day long to get through how I pick line. This is about how I pick the line that I'm going to put on a bait casting rod and reel with the application that it's going to be used in out there on the water. So let's start with what kind of heavy cover to open water. It's kind of the way that I think I want to work this, and I just thought about that as I'm about to pick up the first rod. So the heavy cover, application for me, I think of something I'm going to be flipping a soft plastic, flipping a jig around wood, around sparse grass, around boat docks, around rocks, any of that type of stuff. Something I'm fishing, in a flipping type application, a 7/6 heavy action rod. For me, that's going to be 20-pound test fluorocarbon, and every setup here is going to be based on fluorocarbon. I'm going to do another video that's for braided line on baitcaster, and there's a video for spinning rod applications. That's the dog playing with her bone in the floor is what that is. But I'm going to break that down as specific as I can throughout every application of rod and reel setup. So, a heavy cover, the heaviest fluorocarbon line that I use is 20-pound test. Will I go up to 25? In very rare situations, maybe throwing an umbrella rig, or if I'm on like Falcon Lake down in Texas and I'm flipping fluorocarbon, I have 25, but it's not something that I use very often. But 20-pound line in a fluorocarbon setup, I'll use for flipping. I'll use for an Alabama rig, maybe a big single swim bait, I'll use it as well. But most of the time, it's pretty much reserved for, a flipping type situation. For spinner baits, bladed jigs, buzz baits, a lot of those moving type baits that I fish maybe sometimes in open water, but they're single hook baits. They're stuff that I can put a lot of power, a lot of heat on a fish with when I'm hooking, have hooked those fish. Stuff like that, I'm going to typically use 17-pound fluorocarbon line on those. I really like the way 17 handles. The abrasion resistance of 17 is really good. And these are baits that I traditionally catch a lot of, bigger fish on. So I like that a little bit heavier line. It allows me to, to be pretty fearless and swinging a fish into the boat. So I like 17-pound test on a lot of my single hook baits that I'm fishing on a bait casting setup that are moving baits. Again, spinner baits, bladed jigs, buzz baits, that type of stuff. Again, not going through braid setup right now. We'll hit on that in a minute. Next up, probably going to go to crankbaits. I really use 2 line sizes for almost all of my crankbait fishing. Shallow crankbaits where I'm fishing around targets a little bit more often, heavier rock, brush, grass, those type of places. I'm typically going to use 14-pound fluorocarbon line in those situations. When I'm fishing, more open water, a deeper running bait, I'm going to drop that back to 12. It doesn't sound like a big difference, but you'll gain probably a foot in diving depth going from 14 down to 12. So if you're fishing a bait, you're wanting to get a real small bait a little bit deeper, you can drop that down to 10, and I will do that on occasion, especially in the winter time when I'm trying to get a small bait, maybe down as deep as I can possibly get it. I'll put that bait on 10-pound test. You just got to be really careful with that if you're fishing in a lot of rock. Be sure you retie really frequently. But 12 and 14, that does basically all of my crankbait fishing, as well as lipless crankbaits. The only variation from that, every one of these seems to have a little possible variation, but the only variation from that is if I'm wanting to fish a lipless crankbait really shallow and really slow, and that's when I'll start stepping up in line size. Typically 17 is as high as I'll go, but I will go to 17, and I carry 20 just in case, but 17 with a lipless crankbait is generally as big as I'll go. Another one on the treble hook side of stuff with fluorocarbon is a jerkbait. All of my jerkbait fishing I do on 12-pound test. I never spool up anything else. I never use 14, I never use 10. All of my jerkbait fishing, if you see me throwing a jerkbait, it's going to be on 12-pound test fluorocarbon line. It's just what works well for me. It's plenty strong enough, but also thin enough to get that bait down. And here's another thing. I have, fished professionally for 15 years or something. This is what works for me. This is a system that I have, that I'm comfortable with. It's what I'm happy with, and I'm comfortable. I have the knowledge of how my baits act with this size line in any situation. So this is a comfort zone for me. I suggest as an angler that you develop that for yourself. If you want to implement what I'm doing and learn that, more power to you. If you want to go out on your own and kind of make that, you may find that you like 14 for a spinnerbait so much better and you think you get more bites because of that. More power to you. Take whatever system works for you and make that, your style. One last one that I'm gonna touch on would be like a finesse swim bait, smaller swim baits that I'm gonna be fishing on a bait caster setup though. Bucktail jigs, hair jigs, those type of things. Those are one that I actually fish on lighter line on a bait caster than almost anything else. I generally fish those on 10. I'll occasionally step up to 12. But a bucktail and a single swim bait, if I'm fishing on a bait caster, I like the way that they move on lighter line better. So that's some of the lightest line that I fish on a bait caster on a regular basis is actually for those small single swim baits. And I'm saying small as being anything from like a 3.8 speed shad and smaller, and a bucktail. It could even be a half-ounce bucktail that I'm throwing, but I do like the way that it fishes on 10-pound test fluorocarbon. It cuts through the water a little bit quicker with that lighter line, and I think it helps to trigger a reaction bite better out of those bucktail jigs. So that's my setup. That covers, most of the general basis of how I pick my line size for fluorocarbon applications in bait casters. The options are endless. We could talk about this for every single scenario for a whole day, but that should get you a pretty good basis of picking line the next time you go to the store, which you're going to spool up for a specific technique.